The sun rose slowly over the horizon, painting the sky with soft streaks of orange and gold. In the quiet towns and bustling cities, humanity went about its usual routines, unaware of the subtle changes happening all around. Birds chirped, children laughed on their way to school, and streets filled with the hum of cars and the chatter of people. Everything seemed normal. Everything seemed safe. Yet beneath the surface, the world was beginning to stir in ways that most people could not see or understand. Scientists in remote research stations and universities had been noticing unusual patterns. Fish populations were declining in rivers that had once teemed with life. Some species of birds had begun migrating earlier than usual, while others were disappearing from areas where they had lived for decades. In forests and jungles, animals behaved differently, avoiding areas they once called home or venturing out in strange numbers during unusual hours. These signs were small, almost invisible to anyone who was not paying close attention, but to the trained eye, they were warning signals. The planet was quietly signaling its distress, and humanity's continued ignorance was pushing it closer to a dangerous limit. In the heart of the city, a young environmental researcher observed data coming in from weather stations across the world. Temperatures were rising faster than predictions had suggested. Rainfall patterns were shifting unpredictably, and storms were becoming stronger and more frequent. Each new report seemed to contradict previous assumptions. The researcher watched numbers climb on a screen, each figure a reminder of how fragile the balance of life had become. Every statistic told the same story. The Earth was under stress, and humans were failing to notice the urgency. Meanwhile, life in rural areas was showing its own signs of change. Farmers looked out over parched fields where crops struggled to grow. The soil, once rich and fertile, was cracking under the relentless sun. Rivers that had supported entire communities were running dry, and the animals that had once shared these spaces had either fled or disappeared. Villagers whispered to each other about the strange behavior of wildlife, the sudden appearance of predators in unusual places, the silence of birds that had always filled the mornings with song, and the sight of insects swarming in unprecedented numbers. Some dismissed these changes as temporary, blaming the weather or seasons, but a few began to feel a quiet unease, sensing that something larger was shifting in the natural world. In the oceans, researchers aboard small vessels noticed similar disturbances. Coral reefs, once vibrant and full of color, were turning pale and brittle. Fish schools moved in erratic patterns, and some species seemed to vanish overnight. The ocean, which had long been a stable and vast ecosystem, was reacting to the pressures. Humans had placed upon it pollution, overfishing, and rising temperatures. Yet despite these warning signs, the news barely reached the broader public. Reports were buried under stories of politics, technology, and entertainment. Most people remained blissfully unaware that the natural world around them was already reaching its breaking point. Even in the cities, where skyscrapers touched the clouds and people rushed past one another without a second glance, subtle changes could be felt. Urban parks saw fewer birds, and the insects that were once common in gardens became rare. Pigeons and other city-dwelling animals began to act strangely, avoiding areas that were once safe. People noticed odd behaviors, but dismissed them as inconsequential. A dog barking at nothing, a cat refusing to enter its usual territory, a sudden disappearance of a familiar flock of birds. All were small warnings that went unheeded. Humanity, busy with its own concerns, did not stop to understand the messages being sent by the living world around it. Back in the research labs, a few scientists tried to raise alarms. Papers were written, presentations given, and conferences held, but their voices often fell on deaf ears. Governments implemented minor policies that made headlines but failed to address the deeper systemic problems. Environmental groups campaigned tirelessly, Yet their warnings were often overshadowed by louder debates about economics and politics. The people who saw the crisis coming were frustrated, watching as the signs became harder to ignore, but still failing to reach those who had the power to act. It was in this quiet tension that life continued. People carried on with daily tasks, not realizing how connected their lives were to the delicate balance of nature. A mother watered her garden, unaware that the insects she relied on to pollinate her plants were vanishing. A man fished in a river, unaware that the fish population was declining faster than the river could replenish it. Children played under trees that were losing their leaves earlier than usual, not noticing the slow change in the rhythm of the seasons. Life, for most, seemed uninterrupted, even as the world quietly shifted beneath their feet. Occasionally, moments of awareness flickered. A hiker would stumble upon a forest unusually silent, noting the absence of birdsong. A fisherman would return from the sea with nets half empty, puzzled at the sudden scarcity. A driver might see a herd of animals moving in unusual directions along the outskirts of a town. These moments were fleeting, often forgotten by the next day, but they were part of a growing pattern. Nature was attempting to communicate, to signal the limits of its tolerance, yet humans, wrapped in routines and distractions, continued to overlook the warning signs. Even among ordinary people, small acts of curiosity began to appear. A teacher noticed students asking questions about the environment, showing concern for animals they had never seen outside of books. A journalist wrote stories about unusual weather and its effects on local communities, trying to capture the attention of a distracted public. Some neighbors started community gardens, hoping to reconnect with nature in small ways. These were tiny sparks of awareness, not yet enough to change the course of humanity, but they were signs that some were beginning to notice the quiet warnings of the natural world. Despite these small sparks, the larger society remained mostly blind. Industries expanded, forests were cleared, and rivers were diverted. The pace of human life accelerated, driven by convenience, profit, and ambition. Even those aware of the dangers often felt powerless, unable to convince the world to slow down or listen. The contrast between human activity and the subtle cries of nature became starker each day. It was as if the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for humanity to realize the limits of patience and balance. And in those quiet, unnoticed moments, the first hints of the breaking point began to appear. A sudden storm in one region destroyed crops and homes, far beyond the usual patterns of weather. A migration of animals disrupted local communities, causing confusion and fear. A forest fire ignited seemingly without reason, consuming land that had not burned in decades. Each event was small on its own, a ripple in the fabric of life, but together they formed a pattern that those paying attention could see clearly. The world was testing the patience of humanity, and the signs were becoming impossible to ignore. By the end of the day, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the world grew quiet once more, a sense of unease lingered. Most people went to bed thinking the day had been ordinary, yet the planet had whispered its warnings, and humanity had barely listened. The birds would not sing as they had before. The rivers would not flow as they had once done. And the earth, resilient yet finite, had begun to show that patience has limits. In the quiet of the night, it seemed almost as if the world itself was waiting, holding its breath, for humanity to finally understand that the moment of reckoning was approaching. Humanity's story continued, unaware of the delicate threads connecting life, balance, and survival. The world was alive with warning signs, yet life went on in its usual rhythm. In this calm before the storm, the stage was set for the events. To come a moment that no species would ever forget, a tipping point that humanity had not yet realized was approaching. The story was just beginning, and the first part of the journey would be remembered by those who paid attention, even if most continued to walk blindly toward a limit they did not yet see. Life continued, moving at its usual pace, but small changes began to grow impossible to ignore. People in towns and cities noticed that the world was behaving differently, though most could not explain why. Birds flew in strange directions, sometimes in flocks that were far larger than usual. Fish disappeared from rivers that had once been filled with them. Even the wind seemed to shift in unusual ways, carrying a sense of restlessness that went unnoticed by many. For those paying attention, though, the signs were clear. Nature was trying to communicate, and humanity had not yet listened. In small villages, farmers began noticing unusual patterns in their crops. Corn failed to grow in patches where the soil had always been fertile, and wheat withered despite careful tending. Some villagers reported that certain plants refused to bloom entirely, while others sprouted earlier or later than expected. Farmers spoke to each other, sharing stories of unexpected droughts and floods that seemed to have no pattern. While a few dismissed these as random accidents, some quietly wondered if the earth was sending a warning that went beyond human understanding. In the forests and jungles, animal behavior had shifted even more noticeably. Predators moved into new areas in search of food, while prey animals seemed to become bolder or more desperate. The balance of life that had existed for generations was slowly unraveling. Researchers who had been studying these ecosystems documented the changes, carefully noting each unusual observation. They wrote papers and made presentations, urging governments and communities to take notice. But the responses they received were minimal. Policies were introduced in name only, campaigns were organized for appearances, and the world went on, too busy to change its course. Meanwhile, in the oceans, the problems became more obvious. Coral reefs, which had long been a sign of healthy marine life, began to bleach and crumble. Fish populations dwindled, sometimes disappearing entirely from areas that had once been thriving. The oceans were no longer the stable, infinite resources that humanity had always assumed. Fishermen returned from the sea with empty nets, frustrated and confused. Some sought explanations in overfishing or weather, but a few researchers understood the broader picture. The oceans were reaching a limit, and humanity's exploitation had pushed them too far. Even in the cities, signs of imbalance were visible. Pigeons that once crowded public squares and parks became scarce. Squirrels and other small animals behaved unpredictably, appearing in unusual neighborhoods or avoiding familiar streets entirely. People noticed, often with amusement or mild concern, but few realized the significance of these changes. It was easier to dismiss them as coincidences than to face the reality. The natural world was struggling to adapt to humanity's impact. Amid this growing tension, a small group of scientists tried to make their voices heard. They traveled to conferences, spoke at universities, and wrote articles for newspapers and journals. They warned of ecological collapse, extreme weather patterns, and the loss of species that had existed for centuries. Yet their warnings often seemed like whispers in the wind. Political leaders were more focused on short-term economic growth than long-term sustainability. Media outlets covered flashier stories, celebrity scandals, technological breakthroughs, or sports events, while the urgent warnings about the planet's limits went largely unreported. In rural areas, people began to feel the effects firsthand. Rivers ran lower than usual, forcing communities to dig deeper for water or to ration supplies. Wild animals ventured closer to villages in search of food, frightening those unaccustomed to such encounters. Some crops failed entirely, threatening the food supply and local livelihoods. Communities began to talk about these changes in hushed tones, worried about what might happen if the patterns continued. The sense of unease grew stronger with each passing season, but for many, life had to continue despite the uncertainty. In the mountains, researchers studying glaciers and snowpacks noticed alarming changes. Glaciers that had stood for centuries were shrinking faster than ever recorded. Snow melted earlier in the year, altering the flow of rivers that relied on slow, steady runoff. This had a ripple effect on both wildlife and human communities downstream. Villagers who depended on these rivers for water and farming faced new challenges, sometimes without understanding why. The mountains, once seen as eternal and unchanging, were showing cracks in the balance that had lasted for generations. Meanwhile, storms grew stronger and more unpredictable. Hurricanes, typhoons, and cyclones arrived with greater intensity, leaving behind devastation that communities struggled to repair. People rebuilt their homes, replanted their fields, and repaired infrastructure, only to face the next storm sooner than expected. Each event was a reminder that the world was no longer predictable, and yet most humans continued life as usual, hoping that the next disaster would not hit them directly. The connection between human activity and the increasing frequency of these disasters was not widely understood. Even as scientists and environmentalists tried to make the link clear. In cities, heat waves became more common, stretching the limits of people's tolerance. Air conditioners hummed endlessly, electricity grids strained, and hospital admissions rose. People suffered, sometimes without even understanding the reason behind the extreme temperatures. Urban planners began to discuss long-term solutions, but most efforts were reactive rather than preventive. Humanity's pace remained relentless, focused on progress, growth, and convenience, while ignoring the very systems that made life sustainable. Even small acts of concern were often lost in the noise of daily life. Volunteers planted trees or cleaned rivers, but the impact of these efforts was limited compared to the scale of the problems. People recycled more diligently, drove less, or reduced waste, but the overall footprint of humanity continued to grow. The gap between what individuals could do and the collective impact of society remained vast. It was a situation that frustrated the few who truly understood the urgency. Yet even their frustration was often drowned out by the routines and distractions of everyday life. In some areas, communities began to notice patterns that could no longer be ignored. Unseasonal droughts followed by sudden floods became more frequent. Animals that were once predictable in their behaviors acted erratically, disrupting local agriculture and daily life. Forests faced increasing fires, sometimes started naturally, but often fueled by the drying conditions caused by climate shifts. People could not deny the changes, and many began to discuss them openly, questioning the sustainability of humanity's way of life. These discussions were often met with skepticism or dismissal, but the awareness was growing, slowly and unevenly across the world. Even the youngest generation began to notice the changes. Children asked questions in school about why the seasons seemed off, why birds no longer visited familiar places, and why storms seemed stronger than before. Teachers tried to answer as best they could, sometimes relying on their own limited understanding. Some children took action, planting gardens or learning about conservation, hoping to make a difference. These small seeds of awareness, though scattered and minor, indicated that humanity's attention was beginning to shift, however slowly. Meanwhile, the consequences of ignoring early warnings began to appear more visibly. Food prices fluctuated due to poor harvests. Clean water became scarce in some regions, and tensions arose between communities competing for dwindling resources. Wildlife encroached on human settlements in search of survival. Oceans, rivers, and forests began showing their limits, reacting to the pressures that humans had placed upon them. Each event, small on its own, was part of a growing chain of consequences, signaling that humanity's time to adjust was running out. In the research world, debates grew more heated. Scientists disagreed on how quickly interventions could be implemented, on what policies would be most effective, and on how to convince the public to change behavior. Some worried that humanity would not act in time, while others held on to hope that awareness could spark meaningful change. Conferences and meetings were filled with tension. as every new report seemed to underline the urgency that many policymakers were still unwilling to face. It was clear that humanity's patience with the natural world was being tested, even if most people were still unaware. Even as warnings were raised, the general population continued with life largely unchanged. Markets operated, cars drove endlessly, and factories emitted smoke and waste. People focused on their personal problems, their jobs, and their daily routines, thinking little of the wider patterns forming around them. Yet the natural world continued to respond, slowly but surely, sending signals that were increasingly difficult to ignore. Storms became fiercer, rivers dried or flooded unexpectedly, and animals behaved more boldly. Every reaction was a sign that the balance had been disturbed, and that humanity's time to act responsibly was slipping away. By the end of the second year, it became harder for anyone to ignore the early warnings. Extreme weather events had begun to disrupt transportation, food production, and daily life. Communities were forced to adapt, but the lessons were often learned the hard way, through loss and hardship. While some people began to take notice, many still hoped that the world would return to normal, not realizing that the natural systems the world was no longer as predictable as it once had been. Weather patterns shifted with alarming speed, and natural disasters struck in places where people had never expected them. Droughts scorched lands that had been fertile for generations, and floods swept through areas that had long been considered safe. The subtle signs of imbalance that had been dismissed in the past had grown impossible to ignore. Every region, every community, began to feel the consequences of a world under stress. In farming villages, the effects of these changes were immediate and harsh. Fields that had been plowed for decades now failed to produce the expected harvests. Corn wilted under an unrelenting sun, wheat was stunted, and fruit trees bore fewer and smaller fruits than ever before. Farmers tried every method they had learned over a lifetime, changing planting schedules, rotating crops, irrigating more efficiently, but nothing seemed to help. The soil itself, once rich and nourishing, had become weaker, less able to support life. Each season brought new challenges, and every failed harvest deepened the anxiety of families who depended on the land for their survival. In the forests, the signs of breaking were even more dramatic. Predators hunted in unusual areas, encroaching on towns and villages in search of food. Prey animals behaved erratically, sometimes clustering in large groups near human settlements or venturing into areas they had always avoided. Trees showed signs of stress, leaves yellowed and fell prematurely, branches snapped under the strain of drought, and disease spread more rapidly than ever before. Researchers recorded these changes, knowing that the ecosystems they studied were teetering on the edge of collapse. The balance of life, which had persisted for millennia, was beginning to unravel in ways that no human intervention had yet managed to prevent. In the oceans, the consequences were equally severe. Coral reefs, which had long been vibrant centers of marine life, had become pale, brittle, and broken. Fish populations dwindled, leaving once bustling fishing ports with empty nets and frustrated fishermen. Some species disappeared entirely from areas where they had thrived for decades. The oceans, once thought to be limitless, were signaling their distress. Rising water temperatures, pollution, and overfishing had combined to push marine life to its limits. Scientists warned that if changes continued at this rate, entire ecosystems could collapse, taking countless species with them. Yet these warnings, though dire, often reached only a fraction of the people whose lives depended on the ocean. Cities, too, were showing the consequences of imbalance. Heat waves grew stronger and lasted longer, making life unbearable for many. Hospitals filled with people suffering from heat exhaustion, dehydration, and other climate-related illnesses. Infrastructure strained under the weight of rising demands. Power grids faltered, water supplies dwindled, and transportation systems struggled to keep up with sudden, extreme conditions. People adjusted in small ways, drinking more water, seeking shade, or staying indoors. But these were temporary measures. The underlying problems continued to grow, unseen by those too caught up in daily routines to notice the scale of the crisis. Even the air itself seemed different. Pollution levels fluctuated unpredictably, sometimes rising to dangerous levels in areas previously considered safe. Smoke from forest fires and urban industrial activity drifted across cities and rural areas alike, creating hazy skies and breathing problems for many. People began wearing masks more frequently, but the deeper issue, the environment's growing inability to cope with human activity, remained largely unaddressed. Scientists pointed out the connections, but few listened. And those who did found themselves powerless against the inertia of human habits in remote regions. The natural world began responding in ways that were impossible to ignore. Herds of animals moved in massive, uncoordinated migrations, often crossing human settlements in search of food and water. Predators followed these migrations, creating dangerous encounters for humans and livestock alike. Forests burned more frequently, sometimes sparked by lightning, but fueled by dry conditions that had become the new norm. Rivers overflowed their banks, washing away homes, roads, and farmland. Each event, while localized, was part of a larger pattern. The planet was no longer able to absorb the pressures humanity had placed upon it without reacting in ways that demanded attention. In academic circles, debates grew more urgent. Scientists no longer whispered warnings, they shouted them. Papers and reports described the cascading failures of ecosystems, the rapid decline of species, and the accelerating pace of climate change. Conferences were filled with discussions of tipping points, thresholds, and irreversible damage. Yet for every urgent voice, there seemed to be a counterpoint advocating delay, caution, or denial. Political leaders weighed economic concerns more heavily than environmental warnings, while the media focused on short-term stories that would capture attention but not inspire meaningful change. The disconnect between knowledge and action grew more apparent with every passing day. Among ordinary people, the signs of breaking began to spark fear and confusion. Farmers lost crops to drought or flood, sometimes both in the same year. Fishermen faced empty waters, and communities dependent on rivers and oceans struggled to find food. City dwellers endured unrelenting heat, failing infrastructure, and unpredictable storms. People who had once taken the reliability of nature for granted began to realize that the rules were changing. A sense of vulnerability spread, one that was difficult to shake. Because the changes were visible, felt, and impossible to ignore, schools began including lessons about environmental change in response to children's questions. Teachers explained the concept of ecosystems and the importance of balance. But students often returned home to parents who were too busy or skeptical to pay attention. Communities held meetings to discuss local impacts, flood prevention, fire management, and water conservation, but many efforts were still small compared to the scale of the problem. Even as awareness grew, action remained fragmented, leaving the world vulnerable to the cascading effects of its own neglect. Wildlife, sensing the urgency of the situation, adapted in ways that humans could hardly predict. Birds abandoned traditional migratory routes, appearing in places far from their usual destinations. Insects swarmed in patterns that were erratic and disruptive. Mammals that had been elusive now appeared boldly near human settlements, and some species began competing aggressively for dwindling resources. The message was clear. The natural world had limits, and humanity had long exceeded them. Yet for most people, these signs were seen as curiosities or annoyances, rather than urgent warnings. In the oceans, scientists recorded phenomena that were equally troubling. Massive algae blooms appeared in areas where they had never been common, depleting oxygen and suffocating marine life. Whale and dolphin populations shifted their migration patterns, sometimes leaving feeding grounds entirely. Sharks and other predators moved closer to shore in search of food. Communities that relied on fishing for survival were forced to adapt quickly, but often without sufficient knowledge or preparation. The message from the oceans was unmistakable. Humans could no longer assume the planet's resources were infinite or forgiving. Even in everyday life, people began to feel the strain. Grocery prices fluctuated wildly due to unpredictable harvests. Water shortages became common in certain areas, forcing rationing or long trips to distant wells and reservoirs. Power outages increased as electricity grids struggled to meet the demands of extreme weather. Communities faced difficult choices, often forced to prioritize immediate survival over long-term planning. Fear and uncertainty began to seep into daily conversations, a quiet but growing acknowledgement that the world was no longer as safe and stable as it once seemed. Some people tried to take action on their own. Farmers experimented with drought-resistant crops or new irrigation techniques. Scientists advocated for policies to protect habitats and reduce pollution. Volunteers planted trees, cleaned rivers, and educated others about conservation. But these efforts, while admirable, were scattered and insufficient to counteract the scale of the global changes taking place. Humanity as a whole still lagged behind, caught in the routines of consumption and convenience that had created the crisis. Despite these efforts, the planet's warning signals continued to intensify. Hurricanes struck with unprecedented force, tearing through communities with wind and water. Wildfires spread across dry forests and grasslands, consuming everything in their path. Floods inundated towns, displacing thousands and destroying infrastructure. Heat waves persisted for weeks, testing human endurance and threatening lives. Each event was a reminder that nature's patience was finite, and that the breaking point was approaching faster than most people could imagine. The consequences were no longer distant or abstract. They were immediate and personal. Families lost homes, farmers lost livelihoods, and communities struggled to survive. People who had never considered their relationship with the natural world began to see the connections between human activity and the crises unfolding around them. Panic, frustration, and sorrow spread alongside hope and determination as humans realized that change was no longer optional. Survival depended on awareness, adaptation, and respect for the natural systems that had long sustained life on Earth. The world no longer felt safe. What had once seemed distant warnings were now real, tangible consequences, touching the lives of millions. Communities that had ignored early signs were forced to confront the truth. Humanity's actions had pushed the natural world to its limits, and now the effects could not be ignored. Rivers flooded without warning, destroying homes and farmland. Forests, already weakened by drought and disease, erupted into flames, consuming everything in their path. Cities struggled to cope with extreme heat, water shortages, and unpredictable storms. The balance of life, so easily taken for granted, had shifted, and humans were feeling the full weight of that imbalance in farming communities. The impact was immediate and devastating. Fields that had survived the droughts of previous years were now barren. Crops failed repeatedly, leaving families without enough food to eat or sell. Livestock struggled to survive as pastures dried up and water sources ran dangerously low. People worked tirelessly, trying new techniques and technologies, but nature's response was relentless. What had once been manageable challenges became overwhelming crises. Villagers who had once dismissed warnings about the changing world now faced harsh reality every day. Struggling simply to survive in towns and cities, life became chaotic. Heat waves stretched for weeks, forcing people to seek shade or shelter wherever they could. Hospitals filled with patients suffering from exhaustion, dehydration, and heat-related illnesses. Power grids faltered under the stress of air conditioners and cooling systems running nonstop. Water shortages meant rationing, and residents waited in long lines for limited supplies. Urban gardens withered, and food prices soared as supply chains broke down under the strain of unpredictable weather and failing agriculture. Every day felt like a struggle against forces beyond human control, and fear began to spread quietly through communities. The natural world seemed to respond even more aggressively. Predators ventured into new areas in search of food, sometimes coming close to human settlements. Wild animals, displaced from their habitats, appeared in unusual places, startling people and disrupting daily life. Forests burned hotter and faster than anyone had anticipated, fueled by droughts, heat, and accumulated dead vegetation. Rivers that once provided life-sustaining water overflowed, washing away roads, bridges, and homes. The earth itself seemed to push back against humanity, showing that patience, no matter how long, has a limit. In coastal regions, the effects were equally severe. Storm surges and hurricanes struck with unprecedented force, eroding beaches, destroying homes, and contaminating freshwater supplies. Fishing communities faced empty nets as fish populations continued to decline. Salt water intruded into rivers and farmlands, rendering previously fertile land unusable. People who had relied on the ocean for generations now faced a harsh reality. The seas they depended on were no longer reliable. Entire livelihoods were threatened, and for many, survival required immediate adaptation in ways they had never faced before. Even in mountainous regions, the impact was clear. Glaciers that had once fed rivers year-round had melted faster than anyone predicted. Snowpacks disappeared, leaving streams dry and communities without the water they depended on for farming and drinking. Landslides and erosion became common as the weakened soil gave way under sudden storms. Villagers struggled to adapt, moving animals and crops to new areas, digging deeper wells, and finding alternative water sources. Yet no matter how hard they tried, nature's changes outpaced human efforts, and uncertainty became a daily companion. In the forests and jungles, the imbalance grew worse. Species that had survived for centuries now faced hunger and displacement. Predators hunted closer to human settlements, creating fear and danger. Prey animals behaved erratically, sometimes appearing in large groups where they had never been seen before. Disease spread more easily among stressed populations, further threatening ecosystems already on the edge. Researchers who had warned of these outcomes documented the changes in real time. Knowing that the events unfolding were not isolated, they were part of a global cascade of ecological consequences triggered by human activity. In cities, the consequences became personal. Residents found themselves unable to rely on systems they had always taken for granted. Roads washed out in sudden floods, public transportation faltered during storms, and electricity became unreliable as infrastructure strained under extreme conditions. Air quality worsened due to wildfires, pollution, and stagnant weather patterns, causing respiratory illnesses to rise. Schools closed during heat waves, businesses shut down during floods, and hospitals struggled to manage the increasing demand. Life, once predictable, became a daily challenge to survive, let alone thrive. People's daily routines shifted dramatically. Families rationed water, collected rain where they could, and dug wells to find what had always been abundant. Communities formed cooperatives to share food and resources. Volunteers worked tirelessly to rebuild after floods, fires, or storms. Though humanity's ingenuity persisted, the sheer scale of the crises often made individual efforts seem small against the magnitude of nature's response. The world had entered a phase where survival required constant attention, adaptation, and cooperation, and the old ways of life were no longer sufficient. Amid the chaos, some humans began to truly understand the consequences of their actions. Scientists explained the links between deforestation, overfishing, greenhouse gas emissions, and extreme weather events. Environmentalists highlighted the rapid decline of ecosystems and species. Community leaders shared knowledge on sustainable practices and resource management. Slowly, awareness spread, but it was often reactive people responded only after experiencing the direct effects of change. Lessons that could have been preventative were now survival lessons, learned the hard way. Water, the most basic necessity, became a constant source of tension. Rivers dried up, wells ran low, and rainfall became unpredictable. Communities had to share scarce supplies, sometimes leading to conflicts and unrest. Farmers watched helplessly as irrigation systems failed, crops withered, and livestock suffered. Even urban areas, reliant on distant water sources, experienced shortages and rationing. Water, once abundant and taken for granted, became a reminder that human comfort and survival were tied directly to the health of the natural world. Food scarcity followed naturally. Agricultural disruption caused by heat, drought, and floods made reliable harvests impossible. Fish and game were harder to find as ecosystems failed, and livestock suffered from disease, hunger, and displacement. Markets struggled to supply even basic necessities, and prices soared beyond what many families could afford. Hunger became a common reality, and communities were forced to find new ways to feed themselves. People experimented with alternative crops, urban gardens, and shared resources. But the challenges continued to grow with every passing season. In many regions, conflict and unrest began to emerge. Scarce resources, combined with environmental stresses, led to disputes between communities over water, food, and shelter. Governments struggled to respond, often unprepared for the scale and speed of the crisis. Emergency response teams worked tirelessly, but the magnitude of the disasters often overwhelmed them. Humanity's sense of security, once taken for granted, was replaced by a daily awareness of vulnerability. People began to understand, sometimes painfully, that ignoring early warnings had consequences that could no longer be postponed. Even the youngest generations felt the weight of change. Children watched as storms destroyed homes, rivers dried, and forests burned. They asked questions that had no easy answers: why the world was changing, why animals were disappearing, why life had become unpredictable. Schools tried to educate them, but lessons alone could not protect them from the reality outside. Growing up in a world in crisis forced children to see the fragility of human life and the interconnectedness of all living things. Their innocence was replaced, slowly but surely, with awareness and resilience. At the same time, communities began to adapt in creative ways. People shared knowledge about emergency shelters, water collection, and food preservation. Urban farmers learned to grow crops on rooftops and in small spaces. Villages built barriers to control floods and designed fire breaks to protect homes. Innovation became a necessity, and cooperation became a lifeline. Despite the overwhelming challenges, humans found ways to survive. Even as the natural world demonstrated its immense power and unforgiving limits, the effects of these crises also extended to the mental and emotional well-being of people. Fear, anxiety, and grief became common as families lost homes, livestock, and crops. The stress of daily survival weighed heavily on communities. And yet, amidst the despair, stories of courage and solidarity emerged. People helped neighbors, rescued animals, and shared what little they had. These moments reminded humanity that while the world could be harsh, human connection and compassion could offer hope. Even in the darkest times. By the end of this period, it was impossible for anyone to deny the consequences of ignoring the natural world. The floods, fires, droughts, and storms were no longer random. They were responses to centuries of overuse, neglect, and imbalance. Humans faced the reality that the planet's patience had limits and that survival required immediate action. Humility. After the disasters, after the storms, floods, and fires, the world was quieter, but the silence was heavy. People walked through streets where buildings were damaged, Fields that had once been green were brown and broken, and rivers that had roared with floods now flowed weakly, almost mournfully. Communities that had survived the immediate crisis began to rebuild. But the process was not just about homes or roads. It was about understanding, reflecting, and asking the hard questions that had been ignored for too long. Humanity was forced to look at itself in the mirror and see the consequences of centuries of neglect in farming villages. Families sat together and examined the failures of the past years. Crops had been lost, livestock reduced, and soil exhausted. People shared stories of what had worked and what had failed, trying to understand the patterns that had been invisible to them before. Older villagers remembered the past, the cycles of rain and seasons, and realized how far things had shifted. Younger generations, who had grown up amid scarcity and hardship, asked questions about how the world could recover. Conversations moved beyond blame to curiosity. What could they do differently? How could life return to balance? These discussions, once rare, became central to survival. In cities, the reflection was more complex. People struggled with daily life while trying to understand the larger forces at play. Some individuals, who had never considered their connection to nature, began to see it clearly. They noticed how water shortages affected families, how heat waves impacted the sick and elderly, and how pollution changed the air they breathed. Community meetings were held to discuss water conservation, sustainable energy, and urban agriculture. Citizens volunteered for cleanup drives, planted trees, and participated in local projects to restore damaged areas. The crisis had forced humans to become more aware, more responsible, and more connected to the world they had long taken for granted. In rural areas, neighbors helped neighbors in ways that had never been necessary before. People shared resources, taught each other new farming techniques, and worked together to protect livestock from changing weather. They built barriers to control floodwaters, dug trenches to collect rain, and rotated crops in ways that preserved the soil. Traditional knowledge, once overlooked, became valuable again. Stories passed down from grandparents about how to live in harmony with the land were remembered and applied. Humanity had been forced to listen to the wisdom of the past to survive the challenges of the present. The natural world, in its own way, began to respond to these small changes in behavior. Forests showed signs of recovery where people stopped cutting indiscriminately. Rivers ran cleaner in areas where communities worked to remove waste and plant vegetation along the banks. Fish returned to rivers where overfishing had been reduced. Birds nested safely in areas where humans had learned to coexist rather than intrude. While the world was far from restored, these small signs offered hope. Nature was not forgiving humanity, but it was capable of resilience when given a chance. In the oceans, the story was similar. Coastal communities began implementing sustainable fishing practices. Coral reefs, though still fragile, were given protection zones. People learned to reduce pollution and to restore marine habitats with care. Scientists and volunteers worked together, documenting changes, planting mangroves, and introducing artificial reefs to give marine life a chance to recover. Slowly, the oceans began to respond, and humanity realized that cooperation, patience, and respect were more powerful than exploitation and neglect. Education became a central focus. Schools included lessons about ecosystems, climate, and sustainability. Children learned about the delicate balance of life, the importance of every species, and the impact humans could have on the world around them. Young people became advocates for conservation, sometimes teaching their parents and elders about techniques for survival and restoration. Communities encouraged practical knowledge, such as water management, energy conservation, and urban gardening, alongside traditional academic subjects. Awareness was growing, and this knowledge would shape the next generations in ways that could prevent a repeat of past mistakes. In the mountains, communities worked to restore watersheds and protect forests. Villagers planted trees to prevent landslides, rebuilt terraces to protect soil, and created reservoirs to capture rainwater. They adapted livestock grazing practices and rotated crops to maintain soil fertility. Local knowledge, combined with guidance from scientists, created solutions that were practical and sustainable. People began to understand that the mountains were not just a backdrop. They were a living system that needed care, attention, and respect. The mountains, once silent witnesses to human activity, now became partners in recovery. Urban life also changed. Cities began redesigning infrastructure to be more resilient. Rainwater harvesting, green roofs, community gardens, and renewable energy projects became common. People started to value local resources more, reduce waste, and think carefully about consumption. Transportation systems adapted to include sustainable options like bikes, trams, and walking paths. Citizens formed networks to help each other during extreme weather, sharing water, food, and shelter. The connection between humans and nature, long forgotten in urban centers, was slowly being rebuilt. Mental and emotional recovery was as important as physical rebuilding. Communities held gatherings to share stories, mourn losses, and celebrate small victories. People learned to support each other, understanding that trauma was shared and recovery required collaboration. Volunteers and local leaders played crucial roles in rebuilding trust and hope. Emotional resilience became as vital as practical survival skills, and people discovered strength in solidarity. The world was harsh, but human compassion proved resilient. Even under immense pressure. At the same time, governments and institutions began to rethink policies. Laws and regulations shifted to prioritize sustainability, conservation, and emergency preparedness. Funding was directed toward environmental restoration, sustainable agriculture, and disaster relief. Urban planning included green spaces, flood prevention, and energy-efficient designs. The crisis had forced humanity to recognize that long-term survival depended on careful stewardship of the planet. While challenges remained, the recognition of responsibility was a crucial step forward. Even individual choices gained significance. People began to reconsider daily habits, conserving water, reducing waste, planting gardens, supporting local agriculture, and choosing sustainable energy. Small actions multiplied across millions of people began to make a difference. Humanity realized that survival was not just a matter of technology or policy. It was also a matter of personal responsibility, mindfulness, and respect for the natural world. Every choice mattered, and every action could contribute to recovery or further harm. Across all regions, a sense of reflection took hold. Humans questioned long-standing habits and assumptions. They asked how societies could prioritize convenience over balance, how generations had ignored warning signs, and how life could be rebuilt in a sustainable way. These reflections were not easy. Guilt, regret, and frustration were common emotions. But through reflection came understanding, and through understanding came action. Communities began making changes that were practical, achievable, and rooted in respect for the natural systems they depended on. People also began to observe the resilience of other species. Wildlife returned to areas where humans had learned to coexist. Birds nested safely, insects pollinated gardens, and small mammals thrived in protected areas. Even previously threatened species showed signs of recovery. Humanity saw that when given space, time, and care, the natural world could heal. This realization inspired further action. People understood that cooperation, rather than domination, was the key to survival, and balanced communication and collaboration became central to recovery. Communities shared knowledge, experiences, and solutions. Farmers exchanged sustainable practices, city planners collaborated with scientists, and coastal communities coordinated to protect marine life. International networks began to form, allowing information and resources to flow across borders. Humanity was slowly learning that survival depended on unity, foresight, and collective responsibility. The crises that had once caused fear and despair now became catalysts for cooperation and innovation. Even art, culture, and storytelling played a role in healing. Songs, paintings, and stories reflected lessons learned from the disasters. People used creativity to teach younger generations about the importance of balance, care, and respect for life. These stories reminded communities of past mistakes and inspired hope for the future. The act of sharing experiences became a powerful tool for education, reflection, and unity. Through art and culture, humans reinforced the lessons learned, ensuring that the memory of the breaking point would guide future generations. By the end of this period, humanity had entered a phase of cautious optimism. The lessons of the past were clear. Neglecting the planet came with consequences, but recovery was possible through care, cooperation, and awareness. Communities worked together. Ecosystems began to respond positively to renewed respect and protection, and individuals embraced new ways of living. Humans had begun to see themselves not as masters of the world, but as partis. The world had changed, and so had humanity. After the storms, floods, fires, and long periods of scarcity, people had begun to see the true consequences of their actions. The natural world, once taken for granted, had reminded humans of its power and limits. Now, survivors moved through a landscape that was both fragile and alive, filled with opportunities to rebuild, reconnect, and redefine their relationship with the planet. The lessons of the past were no longer warnings. They were foundations for a new way of living. In villages and small towns, communities had become closer than ever. Families who had shared resources during floods or droughts now organized collectively for long-term survival. They rebuilt homes with stronger materials, often using local, sustainable resources. Water collection systems were improved, and irrigation for crops became more efficient and careful. People planted trees, not only for shade or fruit, but to restore the balance of the land. Gardens and fields were tended with a deeper respect for soil, seasons, and ecosystems. Children watched and learned, absorbing lessons that previous generations had ignored. The knowledge of how to live in harmony with nature became part of daily life, taught not as theory, but as essential survival. In cities, the transformation was equally significant. Urban areas, once dominated by concrete and asphalt, began to embrace green spaces. Rooftop gardens, tree-lined streets, and community parks became common, not just for beauty, but for practicality. Rainwater harvesting systems were installed on almost every building, and renewable energy projects provided more reliable electricity than ever before. People were encouraged to reduce waste, recycle thoughtfully, and choose resources with care. Public awareness had grown, and citizens worked together to make urban living sustainable. The old mindset of consumption without thought was slowly replaced with one of care and planning. Education had become central to this new way of life. Schools taught children not only reading and math, but practical skills for living in balance with the natural world. Students learned about water management, agriculture, energy conservation, and disaster preparedness. They also learned about the consequences of neglecting these systems through stories, experiences, and real-life examples. Young people became leaders, organizing projects to restore forests, clean rivers, and protect wildlife. The next generation grew up knowing the value of patience, cooperation, and respect for life. They understood that humans were not separate from nature, but part of a larger, interconnected system. In rural areas, traditional knowledge was rediscovered and celebrated. Elders taught younger generations about planting cycles, soil care, and the behavior of animals. Families shared techniques for preserving food, storing water, and surviving harsh weather. Communities worked together to protect common resources like forests and rivers. Collaboration was no longer optional. it was a necessity. People realized that individual effort was important, but collective action could achieve far more. Cooperation became a cultural value, woven into daily life, and every success reinforced the importance of unity. The natural world responded in its own time. Forests began to recover where human activity had slowed or stopped. Rivers ran cleaner, fed by restored watersheds and careful conservation. Wildlife returned to areas where humans had created safe spaces, and species that had been in decline began to flourish again. Even the oceans showed signs of improvement. Sustainable fishing practices, protection zones, and cleaner waters allowed marine life to rebound. Coral reefs, while still fragile, showed signs of regrowth. Nature had not forgiven humanity, but it was resilient. When humans adjusted their behavior and worked with the planet instead of against it, life responded positively. In mountains and highlands, recovery was visible too. Villagers rebuilt terraces to prevent soil erosion, planted trees to stabilize slopes, and protected freshwater sources. Snowpack levels slowly returned to more predictable levels, providing essential water for rivers downstream. Glaciers, though still retreating, were managed carefully through sustainable practices and monitoring. Communities adapted their livestock and farming methods, learning to coexist with the land rather than exploit it. People began to see the mountains as living systems that required care, and in return, the mountains provided the resources and protection that communities had always depended on. Mental and emotional healing continued alongside physical rebuilding. People processed grief for lost homes, livelihoods, and loved ones while celebrating small victories. Support networks, counseling, and community gatherings helped individuals cope with trauma. Stories of courage and solidarity became common, inspiring others to act with compassion and resilience. The shared experience of crisis created stronger bonds between humans, as people realized that survival depended not just on resources, but on care, trust, and mutual support. Humanity had learned that resilience was not only physical, it was emotional, social, and moral. Governments and institutions played a crucial role in this new era. Policies shifted toward sustainability, environmental protection, and disaster preparedness. Investments were made in renewable energy, flood prevention, and water conservation. Urban planning incorporated green infrastructure, and environmental education became mandatory. Scientists and policymakers worked together to ensure that the lessons learned from past crises were applied to future planning. Long-term thinking replaced short-term profit, and humans began to realize that survival depended on stewardship rather than exploitation. Individuals, too, embraced personal responsibility. Every choice, from what to eat to how to travel, was considered carefully. People reduced consumption, conserved energy, and protected local ecosystems. Communities rewarded sustainable practices and shared knowledge about living in harmony with the planet. Small daily actions multiplied across millions of people, gradually restoring the balance that had been disrupted for generations. Humanity began to see itself not as a master of the world, but as a participant, one with duties, responsibilities, and the power to influence life for generations to come. Culture, art, and storytelling reflected this transformation. Songs, paintings, and literature captured the lessons learned from past crises. Stories of resilience, adaptation, and care for the natural world were shared widely. Young people were inspired by these tales to participate in restoration and conservation efforts. Communities celebrated the interconnectedness of life through festivals, educational programs, and collaborative projects. Cultural expression became a tool for both reflection and motivation, reinforcing the values of cooperation, respect, and balance. Even technology adapted to serve sustainability rather than exploitation. Renewable energy systems powered cities and villages. Water purification technologies ensured safe drinking water, And agricultural innovations helped crops thrive without harming ecosystems. Scientists and engineers collaborated with local communities to create solutions that were practical, affordable, and environmentally friendly. Technology, once a symbol of dominance over nature, became a tool for coexistence. People learned to use it wisely, understanding that progress was meaningful only when it supported life rather than threatened it. International cooperation also strengthened. Countries shared knowledge, technology, and resources to manage climate impacts and restore ecosystems. Cross-border projects protected forests, rivers, and oceans, recognizing that nature knows no political boundaries. Trade agreements and resource-sharing initiatives were redesigned to prioritize sustainability. Humanity had learned that survival was a global challenge, and collaboration across nations became a necessity, not a choice at the individual level. Awareness of interdependence became deeply rooted. People understood that their actions had consequences far beyond their immediate surroundings. Every conserved drop of water, every protected patch of forest, and every small effort to reduce waste contributed to the recovery of the planet. Children growing up in this environment were more conscious, compassionate, and proactive than previous generations. Communities passed down lessons learned during the crises, ensuring that the mistakes of the past would guide future decisions. Wildlife and ecosystems continued to respond positively. Birds returned to cities and villages, pollinating gardens and restoring ecological cycles. Forests showed signs of recovery, with seedlings growing into young trees and wildlife returning to areas that had been empty for years. Oceans began to teem with life again as sustainable practices took effect. Humans realized that coexistence, rather than control, was the path to survival. Nature was no longer something to exploit, it was a partner, a teacher, and a source of resilience. The story of recovery was ongoing, but hope flourished. Humans had faced the consequences of their actions and had begun to act differently. Communities collaborated, governments legislated responsibly, individuals practiced care, and the natural world responded. The lessons of the past were clear. Patience is finite, balance is essential, and every species depends on mutual respect. Humanity had been pushed to the brink, but it had emerged wiser, stronger, and more attuned to the fragile systems that sustained life. By the end of this chapter, humans understood that life was interconnected and that survival required cooperation with the natural world. Every flood, fire, drought, and storm had